Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. As always, I'm your host, John Berry, and with me, as always, the Watson to my Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Jeremy Sporn. Hey, Jeremy.
Hello, Detective Holmes. Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
So what'd you think of the conversation I had with Dan?
I thought it was extremely interesting, and I am a doctor, Dr. Watson, so my perspective should be taken in the highest regard. Just let's be clear.
That's about the only way I'm ever going to take you seriously. But anyway.
Anything I could do to win, man. All right. So it feels like the discussion around ISO 27001 or SOC 2 or both is just growing. We hear it from our clients, from potential clients. We read about it on the internet. It's a topic that just seems to come up more and more these days, especially if you're a business based in the U.S. What's clear to me right away is even amongst the most seasoned information security experts, there's just differing perspectives. This plays out in an extremely simple way. You call it a SOC 2 report. He calls it an SOC 2 report.
And I'm right, by the way.
Yeah, the fact that you think that is not surprising. You call it ISO, he calls it ISO. Again, just very, very simple way to show us that information security is still more art than science, and that there are different perspectives amongst very seasoned professionals.
Yeah, it was an interesting conversation. And I do think that, he coming from a AICPA SOC 2 background, me coming from an ISO 27001 background, I think you can see the roots of that in the ways that we approach our opinions on both of this. Although we're both proponents of both, I think you can kind of see where we came from, where we grew up.
Is this a nature versus nurture argument you're going into right now, John?
Yeah, no, it's in my ISO's in my genetics. What can I do?
Oh, that's right. Okay. All right, cool. So let's.
Anything else you want to cover before we jump to the show?
Let's talk about Dan for a sec. He is the partner in charge of information assurance services at Aprio LLP. Despite the fact that he immediately comes across as a very smart dude, he's an easy guy to like. And John, this might sound a little weird to you, but you know how when people first meet you, they're a little put off by your ego, but then once they get to know you, they realize you're a good guy. Dan, he's very different. He's just easy to like right out of the gate.
So basically, you like him better than you like me. All right. Well, on that bombshell, thank you, Jeremy Clarkson. Let's get to the show.
All right, Dan, let's start easy.
Let's do it.
Let's start easy. Tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Aprio.
So I'm a partner in charge of the service we call information assurances for Aprio LLP.
Sounds familiar.
Yep. Based out of Atlanta, Georgia, work around the country, do a lot of work. You and I go back many years from my time up in the Northeast. So, that's lead these services, ISO, PCI, QSA related, all the AICPA stuff, just pretty much anything that there's information risk related that involves potentially an assessment or an attestation, we do that.
Right, but specific, and your particular area is specific to information security, and of course, a broader CPA firm, you're doing the same thing with relating to financial.
All the financial, the tax, M&A, a lot of other services, cloud accounting services, et cetera, et cetera. So Aprio, fairly big firm, work around the world, around the nation, one of the top 40, 50 CPA firms. And, traditional sort of stuff, a lot of emerging stuff, a lot of innovation, a lot in blockchain, international tax, M&A, that sort of thing. But information assurance, happy to report. I started with Aprio about 10 years ago. I started this line of business for them. Didn't have that. Mm-hmm. I was with a larger firm out of the New York metro area for almost 10 years and started something similar, sort of a precursor to what we do today. Mm-hmm. And had the opportunity to go down there and start this up and, hook up with the rest of my family that's down that way. And so did that and made it happen.
And when you say down there, you're referring obviously to the Hotlanta area, right?
Hotlanta, although that's a euphemism that gets used in other parts. I don't think anybody in Atlanta says that.
So you can tell I'm not from Atlanta by the fact I said that?
You can tell you're not from Atlanta when you say Hotlanta.
And I guess you mentioned that you were active in fintech, I guess, with Atlanta being, arguably the center of fintech.
Right.
I guess that's probably a good spot to be right now.
It is. And so that's been a great jumping off point because, the fintech companies, And you say talk about the information security, but there's certainly security from the perspective of protecting data, but also about the availability, the triad, right? CIA sort of thing. And then privacy has become very relevant as well. Huge. So all the fintech type of companies, data companies, marketing companies, et cetera, et cetera. So all the compliance issues, the issues with respect to just making sure that they're able to convey assurance and be trustworthy. And that's the business that we're in.
Cool.
Okay.
That sounds good. Before we get too far into it, I always like to ask, just to kind of personalize the conversation, what's your drink of choice? And that can be anything from kombucha through you name it.
Oh, I do like the kombucha. I'm not a bourbon guy, but this is growing on me.
You're not a bourbon guy, but yet you're drinking one of my better bottles. That was just a Christmas present.
Maybe I'm not him. I couldn't be convinced to be a bourbon guy.
Well, you can be convinced when you leave here, because you're not having any more if you're not a bourbon guy.
Exactly. I don't know. I guess I've jumped on the mezcal train the past year or so, and I like that smokiness about it. Sometimes sour, too sour. I don't like the sour. I don't like the sweet. I like that smokiness. I think that can be appealing.
Okay, so I'm going to point you to a restaurant that I ate in over Christmas in Grand Cayman. And they actually brought a guy up from Mexico who's their mezcal master.
Oh, wow.
And he comes to the table and he explains to you the selection of mezcals they have and the drinks they make. And I had a wonderful drink there.
Oh, wow.
I'll give you the name.
That sounds like great advice.
So we're here to talk about, so you're a CPA firm and a registrar and a QSA, right? And those are all attestation, and really that's what the conversation is today, right? It's talking a little bit about two of the most common forms of attestation, right? ISO 27001 and SOC 2. So before we start on that, right, we've got people hear that term. There's this first party attestation, that second party attestation, and of course the best is third party attestation. Let's just kind of frame what, from your perspective, define attestation.
Well, to me, attestation is a term that is a formal term. It's defined really by the AICPA. There are attestation standards that, and there's an array of attestation standards that in the past year or so, and this caused some confusion out in the marketplace because a lot of the attestation standards got rolled up under this thing called SSA 18. Before there was SSA 16. But there were other SSAEs, right? And so then there became SSA 18. What was SSA 16 got rolled underneath of that, as well as other forms of attestation that can be specific to, operational and compliance matters, of which SOC 2 pertains to, and other more general examination attestation. So you can do, and we do this, agreed upon procedures is a form of attestation. Right. And as far as we're concerned, we can do attestation over pretty much anything, but it really just comes down to having a concept called suitable criteria, where management makes an assertion over top of some suitable criteria. And in the information security space, that could be the likes of any of the NIST standards, aspects of PCI, PCI, high trust, for example. You name it, banking standards, and we can execute some form of an attestation that sits over top of those various criteria, where management makes an assertion that they're following those, they're adhering those, and it may be about deployment or it may be about operational effectiveness, and then it pertains to a scope. We get those things from management. We can execute procedures and tests to see that management has really conveyed that their assertion that they're conveying with respect to following that is fairly presented.
Right. So I'm going to simplify it a little bit, right? Because a lot of the people are not quite as AICPA knowledgeable as you are. So, from my perspective, right, attestation is somebody saying they're doing something, right?
That's right.
And first party is, that's you answering a questionnaire, right? I send you a questionnaire that says, tell me your security practices. You fill it out and send it back to me, right? First party attestation. It's better than no attestation, but not super reliable, right?
Right.
And then there's second party attestation, which is I might send the questionnaire and then I might come out and audit you, right? So I'm doing my own audited validation.
Right.
Right. And third party, which is, kind of the gold standard, which ISO 27001 and SOC 2 fall into, is somebody like yourself, a registrar or a CPA firm, right, comes out, conducts an audit, and then attests on my behalf. Like, hey, you can trust that John said he's doing what he's doing from an information security perspective because I said so and I did the testing.
And we followed professional standards. Exactly. And when I do that sort of thing, we're subject to peer review and quality standards. And so, literally we've got skin in the game to make sure that that report that we put out is done properly. So, so yeah, but for sure, when a company makes a statement, and we would call that an assurance, that the company says, and we've seen that, and we've suggested in some cases that's an appropriate form of assurance to follow. It's just make some conveyance, give them some reports, some white paper, some whatever else that says we're doing these sorts of things. And in some cases that may be enough of assurance. If it goes beyond that, it may be an on-site audit and what you called a second party attestation, or ultimately an independent professional
attestation. That's the third party, So let's talk. So we're, today really what I wanted to chat about with you is third party attestation, Because I think that's the gold standard for what we do. And a lot of the conversations that I have with clients are around which third-party attestation should I get? Right. So we have this, I think that you'd agree with me. I think that the two major attestations that most people would consider, or would be considered, would be ISO 27001 and SOC 2.
With respect to security.
Yeah, information security. Yes, to be very specific.
Right.
Okay, cool. So from your perspective, give me like a quick explanation of either, both actually, for someone who might be a little less familiar with it.
Okay, so let's start with SOC 2. Cool. That's the AICPA protocol or standard that exists with respect to security, and then it can branch out beyond security, and we'll talk about that. But that is really a report that sits over top of a management assertion, over top of criteria again, right? In our world, when we're doing attestation, everything is about some definable set of criteria. In this case, for an SOC2 report, there's a complete set of criteria that represents this report description. And if you've ever seen an SOC2 report, there is a narrative that tells the story of what it is.
Description.
Well, yeah, but it also says here's the service, here's the company, here's the service that we're representing, and here's a little bit of how that service works, and here's a summary of the controls, and then within all that, there's more of the body of the report. You'll see a table, and you'll see a detailed description of a bunch of requirements that are known as criteria and associated controls and test of those controls. So those are, in the AICPA parlance, those are known as trust services criteria. And so I guess the real distinguishing features about an SOC report is this requirement to put forth this narrative, this so-called system description, and that can be a big deal. And there's pros and cons associated with that. We've got those that can range from 15 pages to, we've had those to be well over 100 pages because of a complexity of the business. And then secondarily, what's going to be different is with respect to these criteria that are called trust services criteria, the company actually has to document control statements, right? Tell us how you go about provisioning access for new users, and make a control statement with respect to deep provisioning and authentication or whatever else that it might be. So there's a lot of words involved in this. There's a lot of wordsmithing to get that right. That's an SOC2 report. The company puts together all these controls with respect to the context of the system description. People like us do attestation procedures to say that the words that the story that they told with respect to this system and how it's presented and what it does and the associated controls, we execute testing to say, is that fairly presented? Is this accurate for the date and time that's represented, or for the period in time that's represented? So that's, in summary, that's an SOC2 report.
So let's take a pause there for a second. So again, trying to simplify this down, So SOC 2 has you can download off the AICPA website these trust services criteria. I think they used to be called the trust services principles at one point, correct?
Trust services principles and criteria. That's correct.
Okay, so you can download this thing, and really it's an Excel spreadsheet, and you can see exactly the criteria that you as the auditor are going to. That's part of the criteria that you're going to be holding them to, correct?
Correct.
You're going to go through that, good. And then you'll report explicitly on each control whether or not they met or didn't meet, any non-conformities or findings or whatever the term you want to use, That's going to explain whether or not they fully met that criteria, correct?
Exceptions, yes. That's correct.
Yeah, that's right. No exceptions noted or exceptions noted. So the typical parlance.
And the nuance, and one of the really difficult aspects of an SOC2 report is, so there's a criteria that says you should be doing something. And then the responsibility of the organization that's having the report prepared for them has to write one or more control statements that describes how they fulfill that particular requirement. Our first responsibility is to express an opinion as to whether the controls that they put forward actually fulfill the requirement. So if it's about logical access and they don't have an effective control with respect to authenticating remote and privileged users, that probably would not be a suitable control. Right. That would be an exception. Right. Or conversely, they could say, we have this mechanism in place for remote access where we do 2FA or whatever else, and we go to check to see whether that's in place, and we don't find it. That would be an exception. Okay.
So real quick there. So what we're talking about is in a SOC 2 attestation or a SOC 2 review, you're looking at the design of the controls to see if the design aligns with what the trust service criteria require. And then you're also looking at the operation during that observation period of the audit, correct?
One little caveat, 3 words probably: design, deployment, and operational effectiveness if it's over a period of time. Cool. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I think that's a great summary of SOC 2.
Right.
So let's talk about ISO. Right? How would you summarize ISO?
ISO, a different set of criteria presented by way of the ISO 27001 standard that is supported and embellished by 27002 and 27003, and speaks in many respects to similar criteria that are represented by the AICPA SOC 2 trust services criteria. But in terms of understandability, in terms of logical relationships, in terms of information security, you'd have to say that ISO is, along with NIST, is the gold standard, right? Long-standing, tremendous organization, international recognition, just presented at a different level, and the associated guidance, I think, that's embedded in the likes of 27002, 27003. Can make it very useful. And then we're going to come back and hopefully we'll talk about how 27001 can make your SOC 2 report better.
Right. Yeah. They're definitely not. It's not a, and we'll get to that. It's not a one or the other. They're both great standards.
Yeah.
So one of the things, like from my perspective, and you're a CPA, right, by nature.
Correct.
I'm an ISO 27001 certified lead auditor. So I'll probably defend my standard a little bit more. You're probably saying you're a fan of but they're both great standards. With ISO, the one thing which I look at which is I think a little bit different, I wonder if you'd agree with me. ISO has the concept of both the management system, which is really that overarching governance process, and a collection of controls. In ISO, they call that Annex A, or they call that ISO 27002, right? Which to me is highly analogous in terms of the controls to the trust services criteria. And we cover most of the same ground, right? Wouldn't you say?
We do. We do actually, and even the way that ISO presents between the the management system, the ISMS structure that sits on top of the operational controls, Annex A. When it comes to the audit, I mean, listen, when you take that totality of what's represented by that, I think it does map well to SOC 2. They're just different ways of looking at that. So it's interesting that ISO, when it comes to the auditing, ISO is different because ISO says, as you know, John, ISO says when we go do a certification, that there's 2 stages of that certification. The first stage is about the ISMS, or the overarching management system criteria. And so the ISO standard, which is, I think it's great in terms of what the requirements that it puts forth for people like ourselves that are actually conducting the certification bodies, in terms of how it is. And it says certification body, you can't go do an actual test for the operational controls until the organization has actually passed muster on the management system controls. And I didn't really understand the logic behind it, but I've come to understand or infer that the idea behind all that is to say that it doesn't matter if the company's doing change and asset management and authentication or whatever else it is effectively, if the actual the people that are steering the ship, that are at the helm, aren't doing the right sorts of things. Because all the operational stuff will be unsustainable, ultimately will become ineffective. So ISO. And we think it's a beautiful way to do this. Says, let's make sure that the management system, that the direction is in place, the leadership, the responsibility, the risk management strategies, a risk treatment approach, an approach for monitoring. You've got all that buttoned up, roles and responsibilities, accountability, and then we'll go talk about the specifics, the operational.
Right.
And those are delineated in stage 1 and stage 2. And so before you go into stage 2, you have to have addressed any significant nonconformities that came out of stage 1. And after stage 2, where it covers all the operational controls, of which I think there's 114 thereabouts.
114, exactly.
Before you can get your certification, you have to address any significant nonconformities that came out of that. Once you do that, you're going to get your certification.
Right.
Now to compare it back to SOC2, where we said in SOC2 it's design, deployment, and operational effectiveness. Our view is, in terms of interpretation of how the ISO standard, it's not necessarily about operational effectiveness. So we look at stage 1 and stage 2 in many respects as being akin to what SOC2 calls a type 1 audit. So where a type 1 audit is really about design and deployment, we think that that's what stage 1 and stage 2 is about.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I look at things a little bit differently, but I think more the same than different. I agree with you completely with regards to stage 1, where ISO is a little bit different. I think is that in the structure of the standard changed, I think, the structure and the auditor's approach, right? So from the structure of the standard perspective, I agree with you. You can't move to the looking at the Annex A controls, the actual implementation of the controls, until you know that the management system works. And the reason why is that the idea of the management system is that it rationalizes the implementation of the controls, right? Information security controls and mechanisms that reduce risk. Until we know that you've got a risk management framework that's effectively operating, that's properly staffed, properly resourced, properly considered, why should I look at the controls? Because, you might have the right, it's the idea of don't climb the ladder until you know it's against the right wall. Right. So to me, that's kind of the idea behind that. Where it's interesting, where I always get into an interesting conversation with SOC 2 auditors, is that it's interesting to me that I don't think of ISO as being as much point in time as I think most SOC 2 auditors do. Because if you think about it, we're looking at the evidence that we can look for during Annex A. Right. Okay, can usually extends over the course of that whole year, and we've done an internal audit ahead of time. Now, where I think that you're right in a way is that the way I look at it is that, and I might be wrong here, is that I look at SOC 2 as being a much more robust audit, right? And that's why they cost more, SOC 2 audits do, because you guys are really doing, I think, a much deeper dive. It's more a test of many than a test of one. And I think the idea behind that is that in ISO, we've got a management system, so we audit the management system, and then we just sample the controls because we're trusting the management system. Because there's less of an overarching management system baked into the SOC 2 standard, right? The way I look at it is that you do a much more significant sampling. So I think you get a better sense of truly if the controls are actually operating effectively over an extended period of time. Would you agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. But let me say this, that when you look at the management system requirements that underlie ISO, that they're really highlighted or outlined in 27001, and in and of itself, those are good. If anybody's really serious about an information security management system, I would really suggest that they acquire and leverage the 27003 document. And the 27003 document, some 52 pages, and provides a lot of narrative and a lot of very terrific guidance with respect to what it means to have the management system to fulfill the various aspects of what ISO calls the management system, from the organization, the roles and responsibilities, the accountability, what it means to have risk management objectives, what a risk assessment process looks like, how you link that to risk treatment. These are all really fantastic things that I think, and I agree with you that ISO historically places more emphasis on the ISMS, right, and the direction, and are we leaning up against the right wall? But I would disagree with any notion that SOC shouldn't be doing the same thing.
Oh, agree completely. And we should. To be honest with you, I agree with you completely. We should do more robust audits, right, of the Annex A controls. One of my arguments against ISO, and I love ISO, right? Is we do a crappy job. I actually don't think that the audits are as robust as they should be. And, I can't wait to have another one of these interviews with, some good folks in the ISO space to say, why aren't we holding people's feet to the fire a little bit more than we are? So that's where I love SOC 2, is that, I think if you really want to drill in and know, are we operating the way I think we are?
Yeah.
I think a SOC 2 attestation tells you that more. In fact, what we're starting to do is some interesting stuff for people that want SOC 2 level investigation, but they're ISO certified, is using a different audit standard during the ISO surveillance audit, like using CIS, CSC, top 20 controls, to kind of force somebody to drill in there.
Right.
So I agree with you. So getting back to this idea of, I think we're both in agreement. They're both great standards. I don't think you can go wrong with either standard, right?
Well, I would just want to elaborate a little bit on the notion of the relationship, the parallel in SOC2 to what ISO has as the ISMS. So if you look at the words around leadership and organization and planning and and deployment things that are within ISO, there are parallels that are within SOC2. I don't think that they are nearly as clearly articulated, especially when you leverage the likes of 27003 and you get much more clarity. So I think the intent is there, and it's SOC2 is represented, the governance aspect of SOC2 is represented, this was derived from COSO.
So is this so just out of curiosity, are you referring to, like, I know in 2017 they changed the framework, more COSO aligned, right? That's rolled out at the end of 2018, I think.
That's right. It became effective.
Right. And from your perspective, you're saying that's where we started to layer in more of those management system concepts?
There's no reason not to.
Right, I agree completely.
So our view has been for a long time that, SOC2, you have these criteria, and then with this new iteration of the trust services criteria that became formally required as of reports for December 15, 2018 and after. Right. There's these criteria, and there's some 61 criteria that are further defined by about 299 or 300 points of focus.
Right.
The words, when you get in there, I will submit to you that that practitioners, AICPA, SOC2 practitioners that look at these day in and day out, sometimes come back and say, I was thinking that's what it meant last week, but I think it might be different this week. And there are experts that work with this, and we do this 5 or 6 days a week. And after working with this for a year or so, we still have debates about what they mean.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate.
Right.
And so so I would suggest, my opinion is they could be much more clear. And the structure is fantastic. I think it's a lot of parallels again over to ISO. The clarity that's represented by ISO, we think, can make your SOC2 can provide so much more insight in terms of, it says do some things around tone at the top. It says establish roles and responsibilities. Let's leverage other things. There's a lot of depth for sure within the COSO ERM if you want to go leverage that 300-page document. Okay, right. We've tried to do that, and I think there's some goodness there. I would, but again, from a succinctness and from a perspective of being succinct and from being clear and being so being so solid. Again, 27,003, 27,002 for the operational guidance in terms of looking at those from the high level perspective of what SOC2 says. Our view is that that's the way to make your SOC2 report a really strong report. And by the way, when you've done that, guess what you've done? You've essentially fulfilled ISO as well.
Right. So I think we can agree that the combination, and both of us have worked with clients that are both ISO and SOC 2.
Right.
And I think because of the elegantness of the different systems and the pros and cons of each, when you combine them together, I think you're right. Those are the most secure and best environments I've seen. But now, if you're a guy, so let's take a step back. So if you're sitting, and you and I recently both called on the same client, independent of each other, and then had a conversation about it, right? And the question was ISO 27001, SOC 2, we're both. Right. So if I'm sitting there and I say to you, hey, I'm a SaaS, or I'm a technology service pro, or I'm a law firm, I need something to give to my clients to prove I'm secure. Dan, which one should I give? How do you start that conversation with them and help them go down that path to making a decision?
I can, I'll highlight conversations I've had with that company and with other companies, and it really comes back to saying, what are you looking to achieve? Who are your customers? What do they need from you?
Right. I think that's the most important thing. What are you being asked for? Right. Because at the end of the day, you're doing this for your clients in most cases.
In most cases, but then there also is the question also is what do you want to get out of it in terms of your own operational risk management? What do you want to get out of it in terms of your own operational risk management? What is it that you need to be able to convey externally for assurance purposes? Mm-hmm. Is it a logo or two on your website and your marketing material? Is it, for example, or will a logo that links to a certification, will a ISO certification suffice? Mm-hmm. Because maybe you have more of an international bent, or maybe there's a nature of your clients that says we just have to have ISO and they don't mention SOC 2, then ISO is probably the way to go. If in this company's case, in the one that we were talking about in terms of the overlap, they support some of their clients are in the financial services sector, mm-hmm. and those clients in the financial services sector, they want to do on-site audits, mm-hmm. and they want to look at a lot of details, and they're already giving them very detailed surveys and questionnaires and all that, and they're looking at this and saying, if we have an SOC2 report and we present all those details, having those details is what is going to be necessary to really reduce, if not, hopefully eliminate, but if not eliminate, reduce the burden associated with these on-site audits and these on-site surveys.
Right.
So it could be some combination of both of those.
Right. I agree completely. I think it's mostly a matter of like what is going to be the right path for you and your particular client base. Because I think we both can agree that, at least in my experience, that there is more than a 90% chance if someone asks you for a SOC 2 report and you hand them an ISO report, a certificate, they're going to accept it, and vice versa. If somebody says, hey, I'd like an ISO certificate, and you hand them a SOC 2 Type 2 service orders report, I think in both cases, I think there's broad acceptability of both. I don't think you can go too wrong with either report. I think you're going to satisfy the vast majority of clients' needs.
Yeah, I agree with that, John. One thing I should probably mention is that, and maybe you've heard of it, or some of the listeners have heard of this as well, is this thing called an SOC 3 report. Mm-hmm. Right. So sometimes they're like, well, what's an SOC 3 report?
It's one more than a SOC 2 report, correct?
Well, I guess if you're counting, it is, but actually it's a lot less from a content perspective. From a content perspective, I think the idea behind an SOC 3 report is that SOC 2 report, because of what we talked about before with this robust system description that tells a lot about your business, and it might have data flows, mm-hmm. and it might tell a little bit about how you're doing what it is you're doing, and it might describe some significant aspects of what you're doing for controls. That is a report that is by definition what we call in our profession a restricted distribution report.
Mm-hmm. You're referring to the SOC 3.
So the SOC 2 is restricted distribution.
I'm sorry, I apologize. SOC 2.
The SOC 2 is a restricted distribution. A SOC 3 is intended to bridge the gap and to say we can derive from SOC 2 and have much more high-level type information that can then serve the general public or general marketing needs.
Gotcha.
To where you'd have no such restrictions. We have clients that have SOC 3 reports that actually put that up on their website.
Right.
You can hand that out at conferences.
Same with like an ISO. It's funny how each of the different frameworks, like people find ways to make them more like each other.
Yep.
Right. So like you've got people like, one of the pros of a SOC 2 Type 2 service orders report is the level of detail. One of the cons is the level of detail if you've got things that went wrong, right? So we have people that are saying like, oh, I don't want to get a SOC 2, but then they get a SOC 3 so there's less detail. And then you got ISO. One of the pros of ISO is it's just a certificate. One of the cons of ISO, it's just a certificate. So now we got people that have a SOC, an ISO certificate, and they're saying, how can I create a more robust report, right? So we're doing things like doing an SCA as part of the ISMS internal audit, mm-hmm. and then handing the SCA. SCA standardized control assessment. That's through the shared assessment program. Okay. So it is really interesting that I think there's pros and cons to both frameworks, and we often find ourselves, addending each of them a little bit.
Right.
So this speaks to if you're good, right? I think we've kind of done a good job of giving someone a pretty good flavor. Both great, both have pros and cons, mm-hmm. and at the end of the day, either one's going to be good. Just finding the one that's best for you is going to be talking to someone like yourself, right. or talking to someone like myself that'll help them figure that out, right?
Okay. Right.
So talking about extensions, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I like about both frameworks, right, is that you can do more than just what meets the eye with them, right? So with ISO as an example, right, because you said ISO 27000 is a family, right, there are a number of add-ons to the family that can help you do a better job of managing cloud risk. Or I love the new framework 27701, which helps you convert your information security management system to a privacy management system. So talk a little bit about your experience with using ISO and or SOC 2 and some of these extensions that people might need to use to provide attestation of other specific areas of information security or privacy.
You know, I think they're both. There's similarities in both of those fields as well, right? So with ISO and the extensions of, I think you're referring to 27017, 27018.
Yep.
And now
27701.
And now 27701, which will have a separate that will be a certifiable, an independently certifiable.
Certifiable extension is the term I think I'm hearing them use.
Okay. So
is that right? I asked you because you're the registrar.
Well, listen,
I'm the dumb consultant.
We're in the queue to be in the first wave of an organization qualified to do that.
Okay, cool.
And so I think they call it an extension because it is a certifiable standard, but it can our qualifications will extend from being certified to do 27,000.
Plus, you need 27,001 in order to become 27701. So I guess that also could be technically what they call an extension.
Correct. And maybe that's what makes it the extension. Okay, that's a great way to put that. So you know, even before the 27701 and the privacy extension that's represented by that, you know, there was always a thing about, well, you know, GDPR, we've got all these GDPR privacy requirements. And, you know, when you look at GDPR, for example, and you look at the underpinnings of what's required for information security, that's presented in the GDPR standard, it looks a lot like ISO, right? But then there's data privacy requirements that were in GDPR. Our view was always that those data privacy requirements that were in GDPR could be addressed by Annex A, Clause 18.4, might be 18.2, but 18 dot something or other.
Right.
That all the specific data privacy requirements, you could address them by way of.
Yeah, it's in the 18.
You could tuck them in. You could tuck them into that,
right.
And you could essentially have a de facto, GDPR certification standard. Okay. Because the foundation of GDPR or any privacy program for that matter is security, of course.
Right.
So, but in this case, they've carved it out. They've done it as something different, which is fine. The same thing with the cloud security, the data security from the 27017, 27018. Those are also great. From an SOC2 perspective, we have the SOC2. I don't know. We talked about, John. There's the additional categories. So much of SOC2 gets talked about as the so-called security category that includes all this governance stuff that we talked about, right?
Right.
So any SOC2 has the fundamental requirement of any SOC, minimum requirements. You have to do all the common criteria, which are the governance type of requirements, which are parallel to the ISMS, and then security. And then in addition to that, you can choose to do confidentiality, processing integrity, privacy, and or availability. Any of the other four categories.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Just out of curiosity, like when someone asks me, they say they want a SOC 2 Type 2 report. I always think of security and availability. It seems like most people end up combining those two because it doesn't cost much more. It's not much additional effort because there's a lot of common criteria across the two. And I always think of the other three as being more the options. Because I see so many people do security and availability.
Maybe if a SaaS organization, right? If you're rendering,
we do a lot of work.
If you're rendering a SaaS, I mean, if the SaaS isn't available, it's not much good. So that's kind of a fundamental requirement for SaaS. But so maybe that's why you see that.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's fairly common for that. If there's something. If it's a black box and there's some calculated complication that goes in there and there's really no way to know, there needs to be some understanding of what's coming out on the other end, right? Then processing integrity makes sense.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally.
So
now privacy, just out of curiosity, have you, and I haven't, have you looked at SOC 2 privacy versus 27701 privacy?
Not in detail.
I haven't either.
Not in detail yet, but I just look at.
I mean, just for the record, we're recording this after 27701 has effectively been in effect about 3 months.
Yeah. But I mean, the 27, the privacy principles or privacy category that represented by the AICPA is just there's fundamental structure around privacy. Notice, choice, consent, onward transfer, quality, a lot of these basic fundamentals. And then typically, and these are things that go back 15, 20, 25 years.
Yeah, preceding the GDPR, CCPA
OECD, international standards. And so those are sort of time-proven, fundamental constructs that are around security. GDPR, CCPA now introduces a lot of nuances associated with, right to be forgotten and
the whole data subject access
encryption
request
and all that
branch, if you will.
sort of stuff.
Right.
So there's just a lot of these other individual nuances. And going back to an SOC2 world, any of those additional requirements that are out there, whatever that it might be, right to be forgotten, or incident response timeframes, et cetera, those can all be incorporated into criteria, can be added as suitable criteria into your SOC2 report. Mm-hmm. So going back to one of the beauties of the attestation structure, that is, that from which an SOC2 sits underneath of, you can add an infinite array or a number of considerations with respect to suitable criteria to address whatever the subject matter is.
Right.
Again, as long as when you're bringing things in, it's not just stuff that you and I thought up over, having a drink one evening while we're out.
What's wrong with that?
For you and I, it might be good enough, but if we're going to hand it off to Wells Fargo or
right.
Allstate Insurance, they might look askance at that. So we should probably lean more towards involving what would be suitable criteria, and suitable criteria, certainly if it's put forth by CCPA or GDPR or other standards such as that represents, without getting too detailed, that would fulfill the requirements of what would constitute suitable criteria, and it all can get tucked underneath of an SOC2 report.
Right. So it sounds like to me, right, that both frameworks, not only are they both great frameworks, but both of them have some fairly good extensibility. There's some stuff we won't drill into now, right? But you got ISO dovetails with CSA stars. You've got high trust dovetailing with SOC 2 now, right? There's some new SOC 2. What is the new one? SOC 2 plus security, or SOC 2?
SOC for cybersecurity.
SOC for cybersecurity, right? So the nice thing about all of these frameworks, right, is that if you go down one of these mainstream core, there's a lot of additional meat on the bone that you can leverage downstream if you need, right?
You can. And again, I think you can get lost in all that. People always say, is this report or that report? And I always say, let's just put that to the side for the time being. Let's talk about what you need to get out of it.
Right.
A, from your own risk management, and B, from conveying assurance. And then when you do that, then it will take you down the path of understanding the pros and cons of whatever the report protocol is.
Agree completely.
So we always look at that as like, don't let the tail wag the dog sort of thing.
Right. All right. So we're total agreement that you can't go wrong with either. And it's just a matter of where you are. Let's talk a little bit about dollars and cents, right? Because that's going to be a big part of a decision. Right. So I'll start from a consulting perspective, right? The cost to get you prepped for ISO or SOC 2 is pretty similar. Right. Mm-hmm. It might be off a little bit one way or the other, but it's, I think the broad range that you'll see with, good consultants, probably 40 grand on the low end, 100 grand on the high end for somebody to come into, depending on the complexity in your environment, come in, stand up a full information security program that's going to align with one framework or the other and position you for successful certification. Right. Let's talk a little bit about from your side of the fence, right? What are the typical prices and how do they differ between ISO and SOC 2 for the certification registrar, CPA side of the equation?
ISO is a little bit different because, as some folks may know, that ISO is a 3-year certification. Mm-hmm. And so you'll do the readiness that you talked about, and we do what we talked about earlier of a stage 1 and a stage 2 to ultimately issue a certification. Mm-hmm. And then that certification is a 3-year certification. Mm-hmm. that needs to be maintained. It needs to be proven to have been maintained by way of 2 surveillance audits. Mm-hmm. So within 1 year of the issuance of the certification, the organization that was certified needs to be subjected to what's called a surveillance audit. And the surveillance audit essentially is a lighter touch, but it's a means where there are procedures that the certifying body executes to see that system that was deployed and proven to be in place a year ago is still effectively in place. Mm-hmm. And to your point earlier, John, the construct of ISO are about it has sustainability. Mm-hmm. That it is a system. It is put in place. It has forward motion. Mm-hmm. It has improvement. It has the mechanisms in place to be self-sustaining. Mm-hmm. And ideally, continuously improving. Mm-hmm. So in the surveillance audit, it's a means of looking across to test the various controls to see whether they're in place, to do some sampling across the various controls, as well as what we always think is important is some emphasis on the monitoring and the internal audit program. Because if the monitoring and the internal audit program is in place with the organization, and it's feeding up and it's doing the right sorts of things in terms of providing visibility and driving continuous improvement, corrective action, then the system will be healthy and the system will be sustainable. So that needs to happen on year 2 and 3. But the nature of the surveillance audit relative to the initial certification, as you may know, is about half the effort or less.
Right.
So the cost to do that is about half or less of the initial certification. The initial certification, not unlike the cost associated with a type 1 SOC2 based audit, probably on the low end for us in the mid-20s, 30, mid-30s, somewhere in that range, depending upon the scope of the organization. Could be a lot more depending upon how number of organizations.
If you're auditing 20 locations.
How global it is, et cetera, the scope of the business system, because the array of the scope that could be from ISO could be from an enterprise all the way down to a small business segment.
That's right.
A particular service. So, that's the classic answer of it depends, but for ballpark purposes, it's kind of that.
I always would say for like a smaller organization, single location, you're just auditing HQ.
Right.
Low 20s through mid 30s.
Yes.
Right. And it seems the sweet spot's in that 28 to 30,000 for a high quality firm like yourself.
Absolutely.
Right?
And listen, and we know that, and we've had conversations. I had a conversation with somebody this past week, and they were looking for, and they weren't looking. We're more of a higher touch premium firm. Yep. When you work with Aprio, there's different approaches to do all this. Okay, and there's some reputable firms that have a different model than Aprio does. When you work with Aprio, you know who you're going to be, who is going to be doing your audit. And, right?
So just to be clear, what you're saying, and this is, a big difference between different registrars and the cost structures, is many registrars use just 1099s that they're just pulling off the.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So you guys employ your own auditors.
That's right.
So there's a consistency to the audit process, to the way that it works. There's the capability that you can reach out to the mid-audit cycle and ask a question. You have the same people coming in year after year.
Absolutely. So we look at it as a 3-year relationship, not an audit.
Not 3 1-year relationships, which you might get with or
three audit cycles where it's 2 or 3 days a piece or whatever else. It's our business model, the way that we compete is we really focus on the relationship and really focus on having our clients back and making sure that when they get a report that they can have some comfort that the right things are happening for security.
Right.
And I just, from SOC and ISO, you may know that there's just it's still a little bit, there's still a lot of variation out there in terms of quality.
Because I do want to make sure we hit the dollars and cents thing, because I think that's such an important part of the conversation I have with clients. So if you were just using that number of 28,000, right, in year 1 for the certification audit, right, roughly 15 to 20,000 in year 2 and year 3 for the
That's right, or around that,
I usually see 50 to 70%, depending on how you structure things. Okay, cool. So now let's kind of like take the pure organization and let's talk about SOC 2 costs.
Right.
How would the SOC 2 costs compare?
Well, so SOC 2, different construct involved. Most companies that do SOC 2 end up doing a type 2 report.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's the only way to do it.
So, it's not just designed and deployed, which is essentially the certification, but then it's, there's ongoing operational effectiveness. Right. A lot of times we're standing them up and a lot of times companies, if they're getting stood up for the first time, they need a SOC 2 type 2 as quickly as possible.
Yep.
A lot of times that means a 6-month report. We've got a number of clients that are tech companies that have got a new business model going on. There's pressure. Maybe they put this off too long, and we'll do something like a 3-month report.
Right. But typically, 6 months is usually the minimum that
6 months.
And a year, once you get past the first one, it's a year.
Once you do the first 6 months, then you roll into a 12-month report.
Okay. So let's get to the cost there, just so we can kind of have an apples to apples for anyone that
So because of the nature of it, because of the actual system description that's involved, because of all the inspection of all the design and controls and the writing, as well as all the other stuff that's part of the ISO, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lift. Yep. So there certainly is more that is done. We're looking from the low 40s to 75, 80, 85, 90. Could be.
But you get to the 90, that you're using all the trust service criteria.
And
just to be fair, to not make SOC 2 seem crazy different than ISO, right? Like if you were just doing security and availability for a quality firm, not Mel's accounting, and you see some lowball numbers out there. But for a firm like yours, like, isn't it usually in the 40-ish,
40
to 45 for
40, 45,
55,
55, something like that. Okay, right.
And the difference, right, is that it's not you're charging more. It's because of the nature of SOC 2 and the fact that it's a test of many, right, that you're doing a lot more auditing, right, in a SOC 2, right?
You are, and I will tell you this as well, as you're doing a lot more auditing. There is a lot more fine tuning of getting the words right. The words right, because there's a lot more words in that report. That system description that gets presented, the actual documentation, the design of the controls, all the wording is that gets inspected. There's a lot of feedback, and those are continuously being tweaked as well. So there's just a lot more associated with an SOC 2.
Right. So in a weird way, you pay more, but you are getting more assurance. Right. I mean, in a strange way, if you're the recipient, not necessarily the person receiving the report from the client, but if you're like a manager of an organization and you really want to be secure, right, both ISO and SOC 2 will get you there. But you know that an auditor spent a lot more time verifying that you're secure in a SOC 2 versus an ISO 1.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think so.
Yeah.
Let me point out one other thing that that we've got a perspective on, and you may have I'm interested to hear your perspective on this too, John. And that is the role of the internal audit requirements, or the nature of the internal audit requirements for ISO 27001. And
that's actually an interesting thought. I never thought about that, but in fairness to your cost structure, right, for SOC 2, you don't have the requirement of an ISMS internal audit in SOC 2. You can do one, and it's not a bad idea. But you're right. If you want to be fair, right, if you're going to do an ISO audit at 28, you already did your own internal audit. Usually you're paying an external consultant, and usually that external consultant is charging you, let's say, $12,000 to $15,000 for the audit anyway.
But let me tell you,
so it ends up being fairly similar, right?
But let me tell you this. So this is a discussion that we've had over the years with ANAB. That's the organization. That's the accreditation body that accredits as Aprio for this, and that is how SOC2 related output, the testing from SOC2 can be an input into the internal audit program for ISO 27001. So sometimes organizations that have ISO 27001 programs pay for internal audit. They've either got their own resources or they pay for somebody to come in.
We do 100 internal audits a year.
So if you're doing an SOC2 audit and you structure that testing throughout the year, you structure that in a manner that would align with meeting the needs for inputs for internal audit. For example, a phased approach to testing, that output that we produce, we can't act if we're doing SOC2, and ISO, we can't act as internal audit.
Right.
But the output from SOC2, if it's done and aligned to meet the needs of ISO, can serve as inputs into the internal audit program so that the organization does not have to stand up and pay separately for internal audit costs.
So I think what we're saying is that if you really want to do things awesome, the combination of the two frameworks is a little bit unbeatable. Both of them are good by themselves. But when you look at the strengths and weaknesses of each, if you do end up with both, and remember what the whole purpose of this was, ISO, SOC 2 or both, right? So I think we're in agreement that you can start with ISO, you can start with SOC 2. That'll be enough to make your clients happy more likely than not.
Right.
But if you get to a point where you want to hold your own feet to a greater fire, the combination of the two of them is pretty damn good.
It is. Right. You're going to pay you're going to pay a premium as opposed to just one, but it's not 2x.
Yeah, and if you look at it another way, if you look at the cost of a breach, you look at the cost of losing a key client, right?
That's right.
I mean, I'm sorry, but
that's right.
You're talking about the difference between your audit costs in a given year being $50,000 versus $80,000. I mean. And the cost of a breach being in the millions. I mean, it's a pretty cheap form of insurance, I think, for the right firm.
And I think, and then if you throw in some other benefits that it just says, hey, maybe this is it shortens the sales cycle. Yes. Maybe
the marketing value is huge.
It minimizes the on-site audits.
That's right.
It simplifies the process of responding to surveys and questionnaires and due diligence and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So we've got more and more companies that we're speaking to that and we don't start off by saying, hey, you should go get both of these. No. We have the conversation, we start talking about their needs. It's not uncommon these days for people to say, Okay, yeah, and that's how we want to do ISO, or that's how we want to do SOC too, okay? We've got it all framed up in terms of what the approach is. And they say, and Dan, when we get that done, then we want to talk to you about doing the other one.
Right. Yeah, no.
So
we see the same thing. In fact, to be honest with you, I mean, if anyone who is listening, right, is thinking about doing ISO and SOC 2, or is looking at doing ISO and 27701, I mean, there is a little bit more risk, and it extends the timeline to do them both concurrently, but yet there's all in all, there's a cost savings, right? Because when you think about it, ISO and SOC 2 have more analogs than they do differences, right? You've got a scope statement in ISO that we've got to write,
Right.
which is a very shorthand version of a system description,
Right.
right? In ISO, we've got, the concept of a statement of applicability, again, a very shorthand description of a controls description from the SOC 2 world, right? So you get the same ideas that happen in both. If you do them both at the same time, there's not a lot of rework, right? So I don't think you can go too wrong. So wrapping up here, any final thoughts? I think we beat the hell out of this pretty good. And probably a lot more than people who want to actually hear us do, because you and I can geek out on this stuff. So mercifully, are we done?
We're done.
All right.
We're good.
All right. So I always ask this question, right? So you and I work in the same field. We deal with the same people all the time. So I want you to think of either what fictional character, real person that right, do you think would make it either an amazing or a horrible CISO, information security director, CIO, whoever you want it to be, and why?
Oh, geez, I don't know. It's I have the good fortune of knowing some really terrific CISOs, and they're a unique breed, right?
So what makes them great?
Oh gosh, I think they're just they're calm, right? And they're just smart, right? And they can just deal with, it's a cliche, but they're comfortable. They're comfortable with the board, and they can have some, the most in-depth, detailed conversations to understand what's going on in the infrastructure.
So you're saying Deepak Chopra is our ideal CISO?
Probably so. Yeah, it's hard to be more calm than Deepak. Okay,
I think Oprah would agree with you.
Okay, I think that's a good one.
All right, we're gonna go with Deepak Chopra for 100. All right, last question. Again, you talk every day to the same kind of people that we talk to. Right. So based on those conversations, what might be a good subject to for a future podcast here?
Risk assessment. And the linkage to risk management.
So you and I really need to talk, because I owe you a demo of some of the stuff that we're doing there. I agree with you completely. It's unbelievable to me that risk assessment is the foundation of information security, and yet it is the most, it's not science, it's art, it's black magic. It's so poorly done everywhere.
If you were like me, John, you were probably making that same statement 5 years ago.
I was making that same statement 20 years ago.
But at least, and what's so interesting is I will, you get into PCI or SOC or ISO or anything from
this.
Only
as good as your risk assessment.
What is the cornerstone of all of that? Risk. And that is the thing that just virtually every organization confuses, and they lose track of that in terms of what. And there's you and I would agree that there's value to be had there. Mm-hmm. There's a role to be played with that information risk assessment in terms of how it can strengthen all the sorts of things that we talked about. But I think it's astounding that in 2020 that subject is so poorly understood.
I couldn't agree with you more. All right, before we sign off, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn, great place for that sort of thing. But if you just Google me, Dan Schroeder with Aprio, hopefully you'll find me. Speak a fair amount, write a fair amount. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Dan Schroeder. There's a lot of Dan Schroeders, of course, but Dan Schroeder.
You're the good-looking one on LinkedIn.
I'm not sure.
If they watch the video, they know.
Yeah, that's going to disprove that.
Paper radio.
It's going to disprove that entirely. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Well, awesome. Thank you for coming in, and we're going to wrap up.
Enjoyed it, John. Thanks a lot.